Thank you very much for everybody joining. My name is Cameron Tonkinwise. I'm speaking to you from Gadigal land, the land of the Gadigal people, part of the Eora Nation, in what is now known as Sydney. I'm speaking to you from the University of Technology, Sydney. I'm excited to have you all here. I think this is a pretty important session in which we're trying to explore something about the rise of systemic design, something about the rise of systemic design as it was pioneered by what I was calling practitioner theorists, people who were engaged in a reflective practice over the last few decades and have piloted, I think, really extraordinary work. But it's a kind of history that I think is rarely told. It's often something that's hidden behind intellectual property or within commercial in confidence, or a lot of people who are just too busy to articulate it. Though aspects of this story, I think, have popped out at different sort of moments and people understand some of it. I think often you run into people who are part of the lineage of the guests that we have today, for example, and you suddenly realize just how influential these people and the kind of work they were doing is. So I'm really excited to have been asked by my colleague Tim to chair this session for you today. And I will try to get out of the way as much as possible because I'm the person who was not involved in this history. I'm just here to help sort of articulate it a little bit. And I'm going to be very rude. As I said to my guests, I'm not going to introduce them at all. I'm in fact going to ask them to introduce themselves. And so I'm going to just run through each of them at the moment. I'm going to ask them in particular just to register when they started with Second Road or Goldsby Smith and Associates. Hopefully you've all seen that this story starts to some extent with people who are involved in that organisation and were doing work through that kind of systemic design, strategic conversation work. So I'm just going to ask each of these people to just introduce themselves and say when they started, why they kind of started, what they were trained in before they went there, but also just tell us a little bit about what they're doing now. So I'm going to begin with Angela because her name begins with A.
Thanks, Cameron. Hi, everyone. I'm Angela Meyer. I'm a designer who's been working in the space of service design, organizational design, strategic innovation, you name it, for almost 20 years. I came to Second Road while I was doing postgraduate work at Carnegie Mellon University. I was part of a large systems-oriented project with the U.S. Postal Service when I first met Tony Goldsby Smith. And he came out to the U.S. to visit us and look at what we were doing at Carnegie Mellon. At the time, I was working with Richard Buchanan and was familiar with the groundbreaking design work that was happening at the ATO, the Australian Tax Office. And since there weren't many designers practicing in this space in Australia, Tony ended up inviting a couple of us from Carnegie Mellon to come and work with him in Sydney. And that's how I find myself there.
Beautiful, thank you. Gina, I might call on you next alphabetically.
I like this alphabetical strategy. It's very egalitarian, Cameron. I like it. Hello, everyone. My name is Gina Belle. I'm the CEO of an organisation called Cohort that works at the intersection of strategy and innovation and social impact based in the Netherlands. I'm currently joyfully back in Australia with my colleagues on this call. I think my journey was a little bit different to Angela's. Second Road was very much at the beginning of my career. So I studied a double degree at the University of Technology in Sydney in visual communication and international studies, which tells you something about being always split a little bit between some of the more old-fashioned lock-in pathways that were around design practice at that, and my kind of thirst for entwining that with other knowledge sources, ways of seeing the world. And so I spent a few years doing pretty typical graphic designer, advertising, publishing type things. And then purely through just serendipity through the UTS alumni network, I got a really intriguing email one day saying an organization called Second Road with a blurb that I barely understood half the language that they were talking about. They're looking for visualizers. And I was like, this sounds interesting. I studied information design, knowledge design, some of these sort of more emerging practices at uni, but had always been a little bit stuck in that more craft-based tradition of design at that point. And I thought, there's something in here where I can see there's different practices coming together to do something. And I just jumped, really not knowing at all what I was in for, anything about strategy, business, consulting, any of those things. And it really was one of those kind of sliding door moments in my life, joining Second Road then and starting to weave those things together. So, and that was in January 2010, which was the same day as Tim joined.
Beautiful. Thank you. Tim?
Thanks, Cameron. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, so I started the same day as Gina. That's already given away everything. But yeah, really, really great to be here today. I'm the co-founder of systemic design consultancy called Snowmelt. We've been going for about 6 years. We're Sydney-based. But to kind of rewind back to those days, I had studied industrial design at UTS. I'd done arts, international studies, same as Gina, actually, in terms of the combination of degrees. So that had taken me over to Europe a couple of times as part of my studies, and I was very fortunate to have studied the minor of sustainable design at TU Delft under Connie Backer at the time, which gave me a really interesting kind of systems sustainability view on my product design work. I was very interested in the intersection between social change and design, and very interested in sustainability, particularly transport systems. So I'd done all this work in my undergrad, and I was kind of fishing around for what should I do next. And fortunately, I had a friend who I met in one of our summer schools called Lisa Svensson, who happened to work at Second Road, and she invited me in to meet the team. And I think it was the first time that I'd sat down and talked about my work. I still remember the day sitting around talking around the table about this project, about demand responsive transport system for Western Sydney, which is kind of like Uber Pool today, but it was back in 2009. I think Uber hadn't even started then, or was starting at the same time. But it was really the first conversation that I had where I felt like people got me and were like, this is what you spent a year doing. We've got very nuanced questions about it. And I can see Alex Cheek on the call. He was one of the people sitting at the table that day. Drew Harrison probably as well. Tony Weir for sure. So thanks everyone for joining today. Yeah, that's me.
Beautiful. I also just wanted to say, sorry, I started abruptly with my audio problems. So just sort of housekeeping, we would really welcome people if they have questions, just to drop them in the chat, which I'll be monitoring and try and get to them as we go through the conversation. So I think that those stories, the way you've introduced yourself, Angela, obviously from a period a little prior to when Gina and Tim joined Second Road. And we're going to talk a little bit about the influences of Second Road as they've moved out of the organisation. But just to focus for the first bit of this conversation on Second Road, you've all sort of indicated that there was something special about your experience of it when you first encountered that practice, that the work that was being done with the Australian Taxation Office, the kind of emerging discussion as to how to characterise that work, which Dick Buchanan was involved in and beginning to sort of articulate it. I wonder if there's anything that you can sort of tell us about your work, any projects that you were doing, the way you were working, that would just give people insight into that organisation, that time period when you joined, that would just help people show the kind of way in which a certain version of systemic design was being practiced at Second Road initially when you first encountered it. So Angela, if we again just historically begin with you.
Sure. Yeah, I think I go back the longest. So yeah, because my time starting at Second Road was back in 2005. As I mentioned, I was attracted to Second Road because of the work that they did with the ATO. But by the time I arrived, that project had already been handed over to an internal team at the ATO, which eventually became the founding members of ThinkPlace, which is now another part of the diaspora, I suppose. But at the time, I think what was really sort of significant and different about Second Road is that they were actively trying to build up a dual practice of business and strategy consulting combined with design. And that was pretty unique at the time. So we were starting in Second Road to build up a design capability in order to begin to deliver more of an end-to-end service model where we could take things from the strategy end of the spectrum all the way to then starting to deliver, sort of specific plans and ways of supporting that strategy. My first year there, we were kicking off a really large piece of work with Suncorp, one of Australia's larger insurance and banking organizations. And that program was actually about using design across a managed portfolio of projects across all of the different lines of business. And for the first time, trying to embed design in a large organization to start practicing differently and producing different outcomes. At the same time, we were doing similarly early work with other Australian organizations, a lot in financial services. I'm not sure what it was exactly that really caught the attention of financial services specifically to start trying out design in that way. But we worked with other organizations like AMP, Commonwealth Bank, National Australia Bank, ASB in New Zealand. And they all of them went on to create their own internal capabilities a bit later, starting from about 2008, 2010. And I think what stood out in Second Road's practice at the time was that way of embracing those multidisciplinary approaches and combining them in a really integral way. So creating space in business to drive this imperative for design, which was anchored in a really strong positioning in something that Second Road called strategic conversation. And strategic conversation was really the linchpin of all of the practice. There were a small number of firms at the time. I remember kind of playing in a similar space, like Dublin with Larry Keeley in Chicago, and Dave Pitnayak at Jump Associates in San Francisco. But even at the time, IDEO, I think, they were still very early in their experimentation with service and organizational design. They were still kind of doing a lot of physical design of physical products. And so I guess, what was significant for me in that work was we were really starting to question what was the work of organizations. So how did they design their work? How did they decide what to spend time on? And how could that work then be positioned as a coherent system of customer-centered, strategy-led projects enabled by the organizational systems at play? So Tony had named, I think, 13 key organizational systems that we tried to address in how we would design work. And so that included everything from HR to IT to PMOs, risk planning, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea was to utilize frameworks like the ABCD strategy model, the funnel of scope, other types of heuristics to bring design into a business context. And
just to confirm, so you were talking then about that period sort of in the late aughties, so sort of 2007, 8, 9, 10, and
Yes.
then Gina and Tim joining in 2011, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just for everybody's purposes, just to kind of get the chronology straight, and again, I'm not doing a very good job of chairing, I should have done this up front, but recognizing that Goldsby Smith and Associates forms, I think, in like 85. I remember being at the Eco Design Foundation with Tony Fry and being sort of very interested in sort of design writ large, and him saying, well, you should read these papers by this person I met called Tony Goldsby Smith, and that was sort of in the mid-90s. Dick Buchanan's really only starting to talk about fourth order designing, third and fourth order designing from about 91 throughout the 90s. So just getting this chronology. GSA disappears and is reborn as Second Road in the early 2000s. And yes, so there's decades of work in this space of strategic conversations, leading up to this moment at which it's joined by strategy at Dublin, and then much sort of almost later, IDEO's kind of commodification of design thinking. So, sorry, I just wanted to do that quick history. Gina, you talked a little bit in your introduction about what you thought was special about that work, and Angela's talked about this kind of strategic conversation and a couple of the sort of the financial services work. I don't know if you can talk about anything that would just help people kind of capture what was special about what you experienced. And just to clarify, Tim and Gina joined at the same time, but as I understand it, we're in different sort of units, so they can give us a different perspective.
Which I can create. I think for me, particularly the first year or so I was in Second Road, I worked quite transversely across a whole range of projects in public-private sector. And I think Angela has done much better justice to the breadth and depth of the type of organisations that Second Road was working with than I ever could. But I think what really quite immediately impressed upon me with Second Road was the practice-based organisation model that it structured its team around, to give you a little bit of a sense of the culture and kind of way of being and doing that sat in the background of these projects with clients. And I think, it was really starting to ask the question, how do you design things that aren't tangible products and services? Like, how do you design a conversation? How do you design knowledge? How do you design experiences? How do you think of visualization not as graphic design or advertising or product, although of course you need to do that well, but how do you make material things that are not material, a system, an organizational process, the knowledge that sits between a group of people? And so I think that space of kind of translation from theory and ideas into practice was really important there. I think there was a really deep appreciation of all the means that are available to represent and create experiences for people where they can be different, represent their organizational processes, their strategies, their ways of working with each other, so that in objectifying that, they can, engage with it in a way that's not possible otherwise if those things stay ephemeral. And I think then the way that the project experience was being in these spaces was almost, rivers of conversations is the theme of RSD this year, but it was almost, my experience was that every project was then drawing from those practice-based teams within the organization and weaving them together in a really powerful way. And often there was a center of gravity, depending on the client need and strategy and the framing of the activity. But there was something then so interesting about not privileging expertise as sort of a deep individual silo, but as something that is made meaningful and helps change, design, things happen in the way that it kind of creates something new or something more than the sum of its parts. And I think that's, for me, that was an incredible learning experience, because it freed me from, my own boxes and assumptions I made about what's possible in that space between theory and practice, which had felt quite binary to me up until then. But I also think it, that culture flowed through into the way that we interacted with the people in these organizations. I think it was one of the few places I've worked and interacted with where, you always, in consulting firms, use the language of client and organization and that, but it never felt, when we were in those experiences with those teams and leadership conversations, it was like we were together, creating a culture of design and change and possibility to think and do and be differently. So I think there was a real, almost like the inside matching the outside in terms of the culture and way that we interacted with the people that we're engaging with through projects. And that was something that I think still is unique and special, and I carry with me and try to imbue into everything that I do up until this day, actually.
Great. Tim, something to add to this account?
Sure. Look, yeah, I think it's important to remember where design was at the time when we joined. So I'd kind of come from industrial design. I've done a little bit of study in Europe, and I was seeing all this service design stuff happening, and particularly following organisations like Live Work and all the government work that was happening there. And that was really interesting to me. Like, it felt like this discourse that was able to stitch together the level above kind of product design that I had been kind of studying in. And I met this, I guess, when I came in, I joined their user-centered design team, which was actually full of, I guess, industrial design dropouts who had kind of realized that career wasn't for them. I think there's anecdotes of, you know, designing, I think it was Quinn Chow talking about, you know, choosing what color was going on the front of a fridge for factories in China, and going, you know, there must be more to this, like there's other things that I need to do. So I joined this, yeah, really amazing group. I think I was the first Australian in that team. There a lot in that team had come from US universities. And yeah, I think for me, it was just that real focus on design process, that I think industrial design does an amazing job of teaching you that in an agnostic way, because you apply it to so many different contexts. But this was at a whole new level because we were working in this kind of abstract organizational environments. And I think having those heuristics that Gina was talking about was super helpful. I know David Jones is on this call, who I think was very influential in creating a lot of those. So thanks, David. And yeah, I think just the intention in the practice was incredibly strong. So like just making sure that everything was being done for a reason. And I think the pragmatic kind of view of that was not just using tools of visualization or certain processes because that's what we always did. It was always coming in fresh to say, what do we need to do here? What are we trying to achieve? And that conversational focus was just such a backbone of the practice. And I think starting service design or user-centered design projects from that basis meant you can oscillate into strategy, back out into product service design, but always make sure that you're serving the organization and the conversations that the organization needs to have, which was a totally different starting point, I think, from a lot of other firms that were popping up at that time. I do remember specifically one conversation we had with a client where we said, oh, we're going to go through the design process. And they said, oh, great. Is that graphic or interior? And that, I think that was just in my head, that just makes me remember how hard it was to sell design back in 2010, which seems insane now. But yeah, those are a few from me.
I wonder if I can just get you to follow up a little bit and almost throw it open to any of you. So we're speaking at a systemic design, systems thinking and design conference. I've sort of cheekily characterized that, you know, a lot of, I think what I see happening between Goldsby Smith and Associates, Second Road, and then we'll talk about the organizations that have come from that subsequently. It was kind of systemic design without calling it that. I don't know, you've spoken a little bit, Tim, there about the kind of attention to detail that tends to come with a design focus. I don't know if you can talk at all, anybody, about how you would understand systems, how you would think Second Road was doing a version of systemic design, how you would, or characterize it as different from that. Yeah, I don't know if anyone has anything to say specifically on how you would articulate the relation between your work and systems thinking. Stump them all.
Sorry, I'm happy just to continue on a thread that I was just on, just to kind of round that one out. Yeah, I think that intentionality that came through in the work was really, you know, the object of design wasn't set in advance. So what is the problem that we were trying to solve was this constant iteration, kind of the cybernetic loop of like, what is the thing that we're trying to get closer to here? What's the thing that we're trying to refine? So was it an organization? Was it the product or service? Was it a knowledge management system? Julian Jenkins is on the call. I know that was his kind of forte there as well. So yeah, it was not at the outset knowing exactly what we were needing to do. And that agnostic view, I think, was incredibly powerful because you'd move from strategy to service, organizational design, things like new venture, operating models, ways of working, experiences, procurement processes, corporate divisional ecosystem strategies, whatever it was. But because I think the practice was so grounded in this conversation kind of focus, it meant that it didn't, like, you could just move fluidly between those spaces. And I think that was very systemic in that way of really focusing on the social experience, the argument, and creating the fit for purpose theme within the context, which I think is very systemic.
I think for me, just to build on what Tim said, there was like looking back now. So I think firstly, and I think Tim put it much more articulately, but if you think about the orders of design, we're really dancing between those, or thinking of them as interlinked, not kind of like siloed disciplines, but any human social system and organizations with a particular type of human social system or teams within them that we were focusing on back then. So I think that's where the systemicity of the system comes from there. Need things and conversations and experiences and strategies to move themselves from somewhere that they are now to somewhere else. And I think really that dancing between, or kind of discovering through the process of asking what is the real problem here, and therefore, what are the types of solutions or pathways that we need to design forward. I think they were kind of really grounded in that sort of both philosophical and theoretical sense of kind of social system theory as much as anything back then as well. And I think that's quite powerful, because it kind of actually elevates and sits you a little bit outside as a wrapper around the orders of design, and says what really are the core communication and information flows and interactions that happen between humans that enable them to do anything, make a decision, design a product and service, engage with their customers, do be differently. And I think that, for me, looking back, is kind of stands out really clearly in hindsight as well, probably much more than I had any cognitive awareness of at the time that we were doing it.
Angela, Angela, I don't know if you have anything to add. Sorry.
Yeah, look, I was just gonna add in that I think the window through to systems really early on was through Buchanan's 4 Orders of Design, and the awareness that we were, in an experimental way, trying to practice kind of at that boundary between 3rd order and 4th order design. So in other words, aware that we are practicing at a systems level, but that more at the order of simple systems, but trying to push into that kind of 4th order of complex systems, with an acknowledgement that that space was aspirational and emergent. So it's kind of like you're always trying to reach into that space, but maybe not quite always fully firmly situated there. And I think at the time as well, the terminology around service design was also just emerging, and so we were conscious of playing around with that. Like, is that what we were doing? Was it a conscious practice of service design, or how were we taking on different aspects of processes and systems in our 3rd order practice? And I think maybe the question is more about how you begin to step into who and what. So who you're practicing design with, so in terms of stepping into organizations, working at different levels, working at the most senior levels, as well as kind of down in the operational spaces, and then what you're actually working on. So the subject matter of design, and we had a lot of kind of interplay with different approaches, different kinds of clients, and just experimentation with, I suppose, situating those places.
And I wanted to just follow that up a little bit. It seems to me that one of the things that was always extraordinary, and you've alluded to already, even just with the beginning of Think Place, and you've all kind of mentioned, there was an incredible capacity building in clients, because those relationships were strangely long-term for a consultancy. And because they were based on really in-depth conversation, because they were concerned with organizational design, it felt like clients were lifted extensively through this kind of work, and that there was a lot of influence, and you saw things developing almost more in the client space. So I think you've talked a little bit about working with Suncorp, and how much the work in Suncorp actually allowed allowed the development of kind of new ways of working, new things that were then spun out in different directions. I don't know if you can just talk a little bit to that at all, sort of why did that sort of capacity development happen? Was it intentional? It did feel like there was a lot of client education that allowed the emergence of this way of practicing.
Were you asking me to speak to that?
No, I was asking Angela. Or...
Angela. Just on the question, so I think we began, I'm reluctant to talk about systemic or systems design because I'm not really sure what that means anymore. But in GSA, we were very clear that we were working with systems. That was in terms of the literature we read, it was the systems thinkers that we were reading because we weren't reading design works. What resonated between Tony and Dick was Dick's recognition that what Tony was doing was design. And that was the first time we had that naming. I don't think in the GSA era we would have called anything we did design unless it was graphic design, and we would say we don't do that. But for example, Michelle's mentioned my mapping of the Australian superannuation system. When the superannuation guarantee was introduced in Australia, there was no superannuation system. There was a lost members mechanism in Bankstown. There was a residual amounts mechanism in Perth. So there was these bits around Australia, but there was no system. What there was a lot of industry players who had devised various ways of circulating money. So I invented a way of mapping that based on a metaphor of a chemostat, which is a continuous fermentation device, mapped the entire system, and that became the basis for consultation and law formation. And that's the paper that I presented to Dick Buchanan's master's class in 1991. So the point of that story is that it was systems that we were working with. We were working with big systems, and we were working intentionally to comprehend big systems. To the question of development, I mean, partly that was commercial. We would look anywhere for an opportunity to provide training. Training was done very early training provision was done very early in GSA. It was one of the foundation pillars, if you like. But it was also a matter of survival because it was a way of educating and embedding ourselves in clients who were still asking for people who would change the font on a brochure in 1992. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks, David. Let's jump then from 1992 to sort of what's happening now more. I wondered if you could just talk a little bit, Gina, you mentioned Cora's work, just understanding a lot of the work that's being done at the moment by you all in different domains. I wonder if you can talk about how you feel the context has changed and what it is that you've done with some of these ideas. How are they developing? Where are you taking them in new directions just at the moment? I don't know, Gina, if I can begin with you, just to talk about your current work and sort of where it came from, how it started.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think to kind of segue a little bit from where we are, and we've been talking about Suncorp, who are quite a long-term client of Second Road. And, towards the end of my time at Second Road, Kirsten Dunlop and Luca Gatti, who'd been working post the global financial crisis in Europe around the space of strategic leadership, strategic risk, strategic innovation. Kirsten joined Second Road in an organizational development role, and her husband Luca was working through his organization Context F there at the time. We started doing a project with Second Road, which was really looking at strategic innovation. And what I mean by that is shifting the object of design from the organization itself to the organization's relationship with its changing context. And so I think for me, that moved into then the setup of a strategic innovation division as a multi-year investment within Suncorp, which is where I went, and Angela also. That's where I actually came together and started working with Angela. But I think that was a really big pivot point for me where we were starting to bring in things around, complexity theory, social systems theory, systems thinking, but really in terms of how do you actually help an organization recognize its unique identity relative to this evolving context that it's situating itself within, and give it a really pragmatic, strategic design process and framework to invest in managing that through a portfolio of investments that actually start to help it hold this space between who we currently are as an organization, our business model, our processes, our conversations, and our strategies, and the future possible things that might emerge that are both disruptive or present opportunities to us. And so it was this really interesting shifting of how do you train a group of people, designers, people working within an insurance company, a bank, etc., to really focus on the design of that relationship between who you are as an organization and what's changing in the world. But really think about what are the actions that you can take? How do you design an action that a business can take to adapt to that, or create possible future strategic choices that it then has available to it, irrespective of what emerges in that context? So there was a really interesting nexus between kind of futures thinking, innovation, strategy, organizational design, and learning that also involved everyone would be familiar with the inner development goals and some of these theories of adult development. We really tried to imbue that within the people in the team. So, the language you used back then, almost your inner ability to hold and manage complexity starts to resonate a little bit more with the level of complexity out there in the world that we need to grapple with. And so I think that was a big pivot point for me, and really where Cora takes its roots from. Kirsten and Luca are founders of Cora. Kirsten now works at Climate Kick. And just to close that out, to kind of fast forward in time now, well, we really started in that sort of, post-global financial crisis space, thinking about how do corporates and particularly financial services organizations both be a better citizen of systems as organizations, but also prepare themselves better for the consequences of changes that are out of their control. Really now we're working much more in the public sector in the international development space. And I think, everyone who's on any panel at RSD would know that really the focus is on these massive, big, what we would have called wicked problems back in the day of Second Road, but, massive complex issues, mission-driven innovation. And so, where Cora's attention is now is how do you actually seed and create platforms that have languages, processes, and capabilities as the attractor in them that help multiple stakeholders, governments, international development agencies, funders, communities, from vertically and horizontally within much larger scopes of system and problem than we had before, cooperate together with a shared intent and way of working in a coherent, collaborative, and intent-led change way in those spaces. And so, I think we hear a lot about ecosystem design and network weaving, but I think really for me and for Cora, it's almost how do you create almost ecologies of agents who are innovating together, forming strategies together, but are changing themselves as individual agents, and so that ultimately has an impact on how they're working with and in problems out in the world. And I think that's a really difficult space, because I think we often feel like as problem solvers, the problem's over there somewhere. There's gender and climate and, food systems, sustainability, and all those sorts of things. And it's very easy, I think, in the system thinking field to be quite analytical about that and try to know as much about the problem as we possibly can. And I think really the space of meaningful action, knowing that there's only so much you can possibly know about your relationship to these problems, but also really focusing on the human behavior aspect of that. How do you give a social system, whether it's a team or an organization or a group of organizations, a way of designing a next best action and creating possibilities and kind of learning in system rather than trying to learn about a system. And I think that's the practice challenge for me right now, is how do you move in, be there, and really not just use action learning as like a buzzword, but literally do it. Be in there, test, learn, evolve, and derive near-term opportunities from that you can exploit within your current model, which even public organizations need to do, but really hold on to that exploratory bit and really create space for that. And so I think that's really what I see a call and a need for across all of these spaces, whether it's system orchestration, all this language is getting used about it. But for us, what that socio-technical infrastructure that gives that longitudinal value actually holds new knowledge and gives it a utility that can be invested over time in change and impact as things evolve and it becomes clearer the direction that things are going in. I think that's a really interesting space that we're playing around in. And all those things that we've touched on from Second Road, language, conversation, strategy, design, all those sorts of things. How do you think of that in a really fractal way? What in people needs to change, as well as at that highest order of cooperation between multiple entities? And how do you create something simple that can kind of, you know, infect the different parts so that they can be in relationship to each other differently, but also recognize that, you know, these systems are something in and of themselves that's greater than the sum of its parts, and how you know, engage that and give it agency, I think, is a really interesting challenge.
Thanks, Gina. That was rich. I'm thinking you were talking about larger organizations and platforms and infrastructures. Tim, my understanding is that you went through the Cohort experience, but you're spending also a lot of time at the moment with smaller organizations and organizations going through growth. I don't know if you can speak at all to the things that Gina's been talking about in terms of your current work and the role of things like conversation and mapping, and, you know, how are these tools helping the way you're working with a quite different population and people at a very different sort of moment in their evolution as an organization?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I think Snowmelt's work currently kind of spans some of the types of systems that Gina's been describing, but also still kind of working on, yeah, growth of startups, product design at times, but more system-oriented product design, I would say. And then also, yeah, kind of more traditional management consulting, strategy consulting challenges for large organizations. And I think there's definitely patterns in the way that we think about all of these systems, no matter what scale, and we often think of them as kind of fractal, and that these patterns exist no matter what scale the organization is. And I think picking up on some of Gina's language there of recognizing an organization in its context and thinking about those dependencies, I think the experience we had working with Kirsten and Luca at Suncorp Strategic Innovation, I was always a consultant, kind of floating around the outside, so never part of the core crew, but then, you know, worked with a lot of this team, Angela and Gina in Cohort subsequently. I think there was, yeah, just that context and form. I think, like, I've from the RSD community connected with Christopher Alexander's work on form and context as well. And I think that interplay is really powerful when you're thinking about, it can be an organization, it can be a group of organizations, it can be a team, a division, whatever it is, and thinking about its context and what it needs to operate within. So I think coming back to your question, like a startup, you know, they have a lot of dependencies out in their market. They're obviously looking for capital, trying to get their first products on the board, but the same architecture of those organizations exists as if they were a multinational organization. Like, there's a similar activities inducing demand, bringing supply. How do you make those connections effectively and efficiently? So we've been kind of playing out a lot of these kind of mapping techniques to bring that complexity together, so you can have conversations in a really focused way that pay attention to that context that you're operating within. So all decisions are conscious of that larger environment and making that as easy as possible for people to comprehend and share and talk about, coming back to the conversation and the learning side of it. Yeah. And
Andrew, I don't know if I haven't prepped you at all for this, but I'm wondering if I can throw to you in terms of having sort of worked in a service organization, not for profit. So that sort of moment, which, you know, it was, as I understand it, it wasn't sort of part of the sphere of influence of Second Road in particular. Your role there was not, you know, of the same type as we've been talking about. I don't know if you can give anything about that experience, and the way in which, yeah, the work that you had done through Second Road, started to inform when you were working in that kind of in-house position?
Yeah, well, look, I think the evolution of my work. So, like Gina, I went on to the Strategic Innovation Group at Suncorp. But then from there, myself and one other person from that group went on to a not-for-profit called Aruma. And that was made possible by some early work that Cohort did. So it's kind of just,
Right.
I guess there's evolutions of work. And so Aruma is a large disability services provider in Australia. And really the opportunity there was to be able to test out some of these strategic innovation approaches, specifically in a social services context, which was, just a really wonderful opportunity and challenge, especially because we were stepping into a space of real complexity in terms of it was a moment when the funding model for disability at a federal level was changing. And that meant all of those service providers were having to start to think of themselves differently, to go from operating as not-for-profits to operating more like businesses. And I was able to, through that work with a leadership team at Aruma that were beginning to understand that they needed to think about the future differently and engage with external change in a really different way. And so I actually continued to be supported there by both Tim and Gina through Cora and Snowmelt. So, kind of at that network of thinking and support has always been there. At Aruma, we engaged the strategic innovation model in a way to enable that organization to be in a state of learning and experimentation in an ongoing kind of way. So to be able to adapt and grow and change according to this very rapidly developing external environment. So almost seeing it as like a system within a system, if you will. And so just some examples of what we were working on there. We played with the notion of business models as a form of system. So using the profit for purpose or other sorts of regenerative frameworks in place of the not-for-profit model. We explored the system of housing provision in Australia. So we're in a moment of acute housing shortage in Australia, and that is, all the more severe for someone who has a disability and is looking for accessible housing. We experimented with different types of contextual applications for technologies like artificial intelligence that could, change relationships that people with a disability have with the world, and the way that they're supported to get through their lives. So I think, in the really elegant way that Gina has talked about the role of that strategic innovation practice, that was a direct kind of, evolution, I think, of what came out of some of that early thinking at Second Road.
Would you mind, Cameron, if I just really briefly touch on something Angela said? Because I know we won't have time to go into it today, but I know portfolio approaches are a big topic of interest to the systemic design community right now. And really, just to kind of draw that thread back to Suncorp, that's really, we were already experimenting with portfolio theory and how you apply them to this more exploratory, future-oriented innovation. That's what was happening at House with No Steps. But the point I wanted to make is when I talk about sort of these platforms that can be attractors and offer this capability to multiple organizations so that they can both change themselves, but also find shared intent and value in spaces to cooperate that might not exist otherwise. This is a really early example of that. So we were also working with Insurance Australia Group at the time, looking at how artificial intelligence will both disrupt their business model, but also how they might be first movers and really explore, cutting edge new applications of that to their claims business. And they had, as part of their exploratory portfolio, an investment in artificial intelligence. And you just heard Angela mention that Aruma, previously House with No Steps, was doing that. And they actually had a shared strategic innovation option that they were both using to explore questions of well-being, agency, self-determination, the role of technology in assisted living from an insurance point of view. You know, they have workers and life insurance and all those sorts of things, whereas Aruma was looking at it much more from how do you support people who are otherly able to live their best life and reach their full potential. And so that's just a kind of just showing some of those, you know, we're talking now about massive system orchestration, but it's really in that kind of how do you find meaning spaces between different organizations, even if their business models and intents on the surface look distinctly different, and say, but we can co-invest in things that help us learn together how we might be different and take away from that things that help us change, but also create this entirely new space of possibility that's beyond both of us. And I think that to me is like a space of design that's still super interesting and we haven't nailed, because it's really hard. And I've seen some questions about barriers to entry. You know, cooperating is not that easy. Being yourself and being something different with others is a really massive challenge, given how strategies, resources are allocated, how decisions are made, all those sorts of things. I just think that was just a little glimmer back then, and there's many other examples in the work that we've been doing with the UNDP, that Climate Kick's doing with different governments and things more recently. But I think that's just one of the, you know, best examples of like differences producing something greater than the sum of its parts that can be really powerful as well in that earlier work that we did.
That's a fantastic response, and thanks for picking up the question from Karen in the chat there. That it's systems thinking is what you're doing. It's systems. It's practicing systemically by connecting up different clients, different organizations, so that you can have more of an ecosystem. Do what Case Dorst at one point started calling sort of sector-based innovation. The last point, and perhaps I'll close this a little bit with this comment, but just to also say I've been very grateful to chair the session, but it's just sort of reinforced my envy for the fact that I think Second Road, Goldsby Smith Associates, Second Road, and then all the kind of initiatives that have come from it, there is a sense of being an alum of that organisation. There is a community of practice that does tend to remain. It's my understanding it has regular meetups, and so it becomes a knowledge exchange. It becomes a supporting framework. So there's a kind of third system there. There's the systemic design work that you do. There's the cooperative system that Gina was just describing. And then there's this sort of supporting system, which I've definitely learned was part of what it meant to be part of one of these organizations. And it's so strong that it continues once you even leave the organization. So I think that's a very important point to kind of say, if you're going to do systemic design work, you don't just do it on, you have to do it with, you have to do work systemically in that way. We are coming up to the hour, which I think is our time. I hope you've learned something interesting about this kind of history of the development of systemic design, all the way from Goldsby Smith Associates, Buchanan, all the way through to the kind of work you've been hearing about, Cohort and Climate Kick, etc., and all these organizations. Ryan's indicated that the room will stay open for anybody who wants to deeply engage, but I will formally sort of end the session and just ask you all to please, if you can, turn on your cameras and just thank our panelists today, Gina, Angela, and Tim, for giving us this insight into systemic design.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
And so much love for my old lovely Second Road colleagues on the call. Been so nice just to even see your names in the participant list. It warms my heart.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you, RSD.
Thanks, Ash.
Great community.
And special points to Drew, who's up very late, I understand.
Yeah,
same with he's on Ryan's time frame.
San Francisco.
Do we have other North American guests who are in the middle of the night for us? I feel like the only people who are going to be left in the room are kind of second roaders, so I should almost like just leave and leave you to it. And you can all just chat quietly. Yes. Start telling the real stories, the stories we didn't get to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gang's all here.
Raising
hey,
it
JB.
together. Hi, Michelle.
Yes, I thought Michelle seemed to be driving, I thought at one point I saw.
Yeah. Hi, Cameron. I actually wanted to comment, but got a bit late. I wrote my comment in the chat. So I'm in India, and here the conversations on design are kind of limited to UI, UX, and service design, system design. They're still buzzwords. So
Yeah.
in India, you know, everybody likes to run after buzzwords. So whenever there's something new,
Yeah.
but I don't think that sensibility or the capability is there yet. From what I've heard, you know, in the conversations, in Australia, you know, things were moving much like 10 years, 15 years, 20 years ago. But in India, we are still at a cusp of this design thinking and service design. So it kind of reminds me of something I read in a book by Lucy Kimball, where, you know, she quoted Elizabeth Shove's infrastructures, practices, and stories that, you know, innovation actually happens when there is an infrastructure. The first layer is that there has to be an infrastructure, and then you have to tell the right stories, and then skills have to be developed. So in that sense, I'm not sure how far things can be actually designed, because see, the government has to create the infrastructure first, and then people have to tell the right stories. And I believe that is where the problem is, because people are not hearing the right stories. In India, especially, you know, it seems like we're going back to the medieval ages in terms of the stories which we are listening to. And I'm sure the same is true for America as well. The kind of things that are, you know, we are listening. And the third thing is, you know, so the practices actually come out of these things. So infrastructure, stories, and skills. The skills have to be developed. So I mean, when we talk about complexity systems, so I'm not sure how far we are in control of all these things. So system is a big monster.
Yep. No, of course, it's a great question. I think part of what I was hearing from the history of Second Road is there are particular ways of coordinating over time that might not be strictly designable in a kind of more engineering sense, but these kind of communities of practice can build. I see John Thacker's on the call, which just makes me think about the first time I met John at a Doors of Perception conference in Delhi. And I do remember that you know, there were sophisticated kind of accounts of design innovation in a sustainable context coming out of India at that time that I found sort of very instructive. So I think the question is, there's not one story, there are many stories. So I think your comments are really important. I would just particularly go to that last one about skills, which was, I was sort of ham-fistedly asking this question about the kind of skill development that I think Second Road seemed to have this capacity to do with clients, which someone else asked a question right at the end. I don't know if my panelists saw it, about the controversial question about acquisition in terms of big consultancies. I mean, you would imagine that acquisition would allow integration in the way Gina was talking about it, in that you have many clients because you're a big consultancy, and yet we don't ever seem to see, they seem to run as internal competitive units. They don't seem to do integration across sectors in that way. Perhaps I'm talking about things about which I don't know. But I don't know if anybody wanted to comment about acquisition or comment generally, again, about that kind of skills development in clients, or the importance of stories. It seems to me that we also uncovered that Dick Buchanan's story, which I think he would be very offended if he heard me call it that, around orders of design, you know, has been an incredibly powerful rhetorical device, if I can be facetious, because Drew's on the call. Yes, I don't know if anyone wanted to drop in about that. Stories, skills.
I have this thought that
sorry,
there was. Oh, I just have this thought that at the time when Second Road was really kind of emerging, that there was something going on in the business landscape in Australia. And you asked Angela before, you were saying like, what was it about the insurance companies that made them especially interested? I think my kind of like back seat hypothesis is actually that they had kind of these duopolies, and they were very close to capturing the market. And so they weren't really competing in a traditional way. And so the executives kind of needed some other way to create legacy, and like innovation at the scale that Second Road was talking about was relevant. Whereas like in the US, it was still like more like cut and throat. You had like Geico insurance companies like going down on price. And so it was a very different competitive environment. And I can't help but think that that must have been part of why like Second Road emerged at that time, that like there was some kind of other type of innovation that the organizations were looking for that was like on some different kind of scale. And I wonder like what's going on in India, to your question, Abe, about like why would or wouldn't people take it up? I do feel like there's something about having the right kind of clients with the right appetite, that makes it relevant. That's one of the sort of things I've always had in the back of my mind.
But that's an incredibly interesting answer, Alex. It's interesting to kind of say, yes, when you've cornered the market and you've got nothing left to do, then you finally got the luxury to start to be systemic, is my sort of facetious version of what you just said.
I mean, my hypothesis, I'd take it as it's a bit tongue in cheek, because there must be other things as well. But I came from the US, and I was one of the ones that studied, in like with Larry Keeley was my professor, and it was the conversation was more about product system innovation and customer experience innovation, whereas when I came to Australia, the conversation was at like strategic innovation, and strategy was the object of design, and that was that was what attracted me to come over here. That it's bigger picture.
Right, but it's the version of strategy that's the complete opposite of sort of Roger Martin's. It's kind of like, you don't need strategy to work out what you're competing on, because you're not competing. So you should develop strategy in the more systemic sense now. Like it's so again, I'm being facetious, but I think there's something really incredibly interesting about what you're saying. And so to try and make it more serious, it seems to say, I think, something more interesting about government design. And obviously, the ATO being like this first really important client, and to say, because governments are in the same position as duopolies or triopolies in Australia, where they're not competing in that strategy sense. And so they should be thinking strategically in the systemic sense, which again, it's a country of duopolies and big government. And so that's why it's been so good at doing this. Does it feel like those days are over, though? It feels like lots of consultancies doing service design seem to be crashing and burning right now. There's very little left around on the ground. It feels like those days of those clients. I don't know if anyone can make me feel good about the clients that are around, but
I think that's a very valid observation, Cameron, in terms of consultancies focusing on advisory or expert advisory services to organizations, corporate-based organizations, as opposed to government organizations. I think that's a very valid distinction between where is the focus for systemic change. So governments having purpose-based strategic agendas, as opposed to corporates who have capital-based strategic agendas. I want to make more money, or I want to make society better for public. I think there is still that very transactionary approach for a lot of consultancies who just want to bite the cherry off the cake and continue to earn revenue, right, as a strategic advisory services model, as opposed to actually implementing real change that's actually going to make a difference for people and planet, right, purpose-based. And so I still think there's this massive dividing wedge between corporations who, you know, are pressured to get on the bandwagon about, you know, being more purposeful for their staff and for the people that they creating value for. And to Abe's point, the more remote you are for certain levels of thinking up the strategic chain is going to shift the balance around where is the focus for good, purposeful, strategic design versus, you know, systematic approach for governments that have more holistic approach for, you know, for real change. That's what I've seen certainly in the last 5 years, you know, having the opportunity of working in different consultancies across the UK, Asia, and India. Yeah. Does that kind of make sense?
I think just to build on that a little bit, I think I'm probably doing that thing, memes that misattribute quotes, but there's a Nora Bateson likes to say a lot, you can't stay the same and be different at the same time. Like, it's actually not possible. And I think what it really brings to mind for me from my own experience is that I think still I see so much in social impact, you know, the social transformation, doesn't matter whether you're in government, public, private, this sense of we want to be more socially minded with respect to how we help fix these problems, solve these problems out there. And there's still such a kind of separation in a lot of these instances from like the identity of the organization. And I think you can't, I or my organization can't change climate, positively impact the actions that we take, the way that we bring ourselves and our resources and cooperate with others. That's what we can change and design. And so I think there's something really interesting and critical for me, which is actually one of the really big challenges, you know, anywhere, India, Australia, in Europe, is how willing are you to change yourself to contribute to changing the world? And it's that kind of reflexive move. How do you kind of hold that space that I think is incredibly difficult? And I think, you know, there's been a lot of questions around, awareness of design, interest in higher orders of design or barriers to this. But I think really fundamentally, how much complexity you're willing to acknowledge in your role or as an organization, and therefore admit how little control you actually have over what you're doing and where you're doing it. And without kind of having that conversation, or which is getting into sort of latent and emerging needs, right, that organizations have rather than probably current ones, you can't really move into a space of then being adaptive if you can't map out or objectify in some way that sense of not complexity in an analytical sense, but what's relevant about this to me? What particular uncertainties or decisions and actions does that complexity create for me as my organization with my business model and my identity? And I think that's a really hard thing to hold as a capability and a practice, whether it's in leaders or teams or anywhere. But I think it's really, that's the space each of us has to kind of hold inside ourselves. And then as bigger teams, systems, organizations, I think to really make any kind of difference as a global, whatever, collective in solving these problems, because it is a constant process of outside and inside. And I think, you know, I understand why, but I think the way we even talk about solving these problems doesn't often combine in the same sentence changing ourselves to contribute to acting differently to impact those problems.
Might just build on that, Gina. I think it's in a funny kind of way, organizations are allergic to complexity, and I think there's, at least what I see in working with large organizations, there's such a tendency to want to simplify everything, and in that simplification is a kind of de-systemization. So you're trying to pull things apart and break them down into the smallest components. And I think I saw a comment in the chat from Julian, I think making kind of a similar observation about not having accountability for the system as a whole. Julian, I don't know if you wanted to speak about that, but I think there's definitely something in that, just in terms of the management science approach to breaking things down into parts.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can now. We saw you struggling with the interface. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I'm doing this via my phone, and I'm having to move between multiple screens. Yeah, look, I think you picked up correctly, Angela, on what I was kind of getting at. In fact, I wish I'd thought of the term organisational immune system as a barrier to entry. One would like to think that large corporations would be, would understand that the world is complex and want to grapple with that. The reality is, I think that in many cases, they want to keep the world as simple as possible. And what I noted in my comment was even at the basic level of management incentives, which is one of those sort of interesting systemic elements that isn't all that visible when you're thinking about what are key levers for change, but actually it's one of those factors that actually plays a really important role in what happens in organisations. So, there are relatively few people in senior management in organisations who are willing to grapple with complexity, and part of that is also the fact that you don't tend to see quick or easy or tangible even results that you can tie back to one person's contribution or role or leadership. So it's much more appealing to people in management positions to be able to point to something that they've personally achieved or maybe their team's achieved. It's much harder to generate that same sort of enthusiasm for changing a system where you may not even see the material changes during the term of your tenure, which doesn't create any short-term reward. It might, if you're purposeful enough to feel that there's a long-term value in that, then that's great. But it is hard to get people to want to try and play with something which is complex and which may not actually see any real results in the time frame you'd like it to.
Is that, sorry, just listening to Julian's answer made me think, my outsider sense was that strategic conversations were about transformation, and organisations, having developed patterns of conversations from an engagement with Second Road, would have a learning organisation in them. But I didn't get a sense that being more adaptive to complexity was the kind of thing that Second Road was aiming towards. It does feel like the sort of thing that the spin-off organisations started exploring, more of an emphasis on futures, more of an emphasis on complexity. So I don't know if it gets at anything that was, this would be terrible language, I'll use my outsider status to say, limited about what Second Road's approach was able to get to. I don't know if that was like its way of working was able to get at complexity, whether that was a development that had to occur outside, or am I just over-reading that distinction? Just trying to get some of you fighting. I just think there's too much friendliness here.
One of the things that I commented when we were talking about what was like Second Road doing systemic design was I felt that it was very much focused on the kind of ecosystem of human stakeholders. So I think there was a lot of complex, kind of enough complexity in that. But it was, that's my take, is that it was much more focused on that kind of human stakeholders, but it was often looking at a quite broad range of them. Like I remember we did some work with like a healthcare company, and it was talking about private health insurance and looking at why people have private health insurance. And it was definitely not just about for their own use as a customer, but talking about like broader value of private health insurance in the social system. And we did lots of work in other types of indigenous communities and things like that, where we're definitely not just looking at kind of organization customer like commercial relationship. So I think that, but it was almost always looking at human stakeholders.
I think, Alex, just to build on that as well, like if I think about, really deceptively simple heuristics like the funnel of scope and things like that, I think we were really deliberate about making a choice about what are you trying to design or direct design in your conversations towards influencing. Is it sector level, your organization level, and really playing around with that, not necessarily to then talk relationally between the different layers, but to be recognized that it is nested. You are situated, within and then other things are within you, and then play around with your design, always acknowledging that, but then probably focusing more within the kind of, you know, unit of the system, which was the team or the organization of the client necessarily so. But I think always kind of making sure they see in their frame what they've deliberately chosen to allow into their frame of design, and therefore the scope of the projects that we worked on. And I think that's, there's something kind of, it's about the question of relevance, right? I think that's come up a few times. You know, you can map everything that you want, but what's relevant about that and within your means to act on within all of this complexity? And I think that was really key in Second Road, even if we weren't using the language of system thinking and complexity back then, that was really in the core DNA, I think.
I've got an example.
Oh, sorry, you go, Michelle.
Sorry, Drew. So as an example of where, so the ACDB, the first section of it is your system and focus. You know, as Gina says, defining what that system is, what's too high of a scope, what's too low of a scope. But for, say, roads and maritime services, we did a project where their stakeholder group was all the utilities across the Eastern Seaboard, as well as other governments, as well as more local stakeholders. And so that system is drawn across that whole entire system of stakeholders around anyone involved in road construction and work on roads. So that's quite a large system. And so we're very deliberate about, you know, drawing that boundary along that and bringing all those stakeholders, as many of them as possible, together in the room. And the goal, the object of design is to sort of principle this. So as opposed to, say, an organizational strategy as the design product. So that's just an example.
Well, I've lost her. We lost you, Michelle, just at the end there. It wasn't so clear. Sorry, Drew, do you want to pick up?
Oh, I was just going to add, and if I use Tony and Luca as types, so I'm not commenting on them as people, but one thing that stuck out to me was, you think Tony, I mean, he's heavily influenced by the Romantic tradition, right? So he would talk about ism-plastic imagination. He would quote Coleridge. He would quote Wordsworth. You know, he's an arts major, basically. Luca was coming much more from kind of an evolutionary background at complex adaptive systems, a science major, if I can put it that way. That's be funny given that he had a background in arts as well. So that's what I mean by I'm using them as types. And there was definitely a tension where, like in the rhetorical tradition, it came down to, can this, you go back to the Greeks, it's can this one person talking move all of these people? And to Alex's point, it's very much grounded in humans to humans. It's thinking in quite a political way. And that's really interesting, in that it also picks up on what Gina was saying about relevance, what's relevant for these people. That's how you find the means of persuasion. But it did exclude a lot of the more, you know, and I don't need to recap because I'm looking at Tim, Angela, and Gina, who could all speak far more eloquently than me to this. But I remember once I had a conversation with Luca, and it struck me where, once again, at the level of type, it wasn't about a personal animus, but I had this moment of kind of going, Tony is about a person standing in front of people, persuading them, and Luca is about, I'll go back to what Gina said about shifting the lens from look at the organization or look at us to look at these relations, look at these, look at the context more. And I almost feel like there was a kind of a foreground background thing, because in my typology, it's not that the conversation ignored the system, but that shift in, you know, there is a real shift in emphasis and quite a strong philosophical disagreement between the Romantic tradition and the Enlightenment tradition of kind of, should we think in the first person or the third person? Should we emphasize the human or the technical? Should we make it about persuasion? Should we make it about emergence and adaptation? Yeah.
No, I think that's really interesting, Drew, and not to try to resolve that philosophical tension that you've just raised, but I think it's still central to Cora's work, is almost how do you give a system agency rather than individuals within a system agency? And I think that often gets misinterpreted as being top down, but it's absolutely not the intention of it at all. And it really is seeking after what Julian was touching on, is whose responsibility is the long-term stewardship of a system, whether that's an organization or a country or a city. But also, how do you make material a system as an identity in and of itself that's greater than the sum of the parts of any leaders or communities or organizations and agencies within it? And that's an incredible tricky space. And I think, to Julian's point, I think some of the ways we've tried to resolve that, starting with Suncorp, is, well, let's go in at the governance level, for instance. Surely a board, in an organizational sense, their primary responsibility is the long-term resilience and renewal of the organization. And of course, the focus is mostly financial when you ask that question. But that's really what we did at Suncorp. We started at the board level and said, how can we make the board and therefore the whole organization accountable to future potential disruptions and changes, and actually invest in a core capability as an organization to be able to explore, adapt, and generate as a core capability strategic choices, options that we can have there, in our back pocket, no matter what emerges. And that was a pretty bold move. And I think we've heard sort of two reasons why people might or might not invest in these types of initiatives. One might be they have no choice. There's a crisis or a disruption, and the other is they have the luxury of it. And Suncorp was probably more in that boat, if we're honest. The insurance division that we're in, it was, at the peak of its profitability. And we had an extraordinary leader there who said it's actually when we're at the top that we should really be investing in the things that are going to disrupt us or pull the rug out from underneath us, how the context might change, how human experience might change, how this business model might become irrelevant. And so I think there's just something interesting there, but how you kind of imbue that sort of vertically and horizontally and hold that as not sort of a polarity, but actually something that becomes part of the DNA of the system. And as Julian says, how do you work around those allergic reactions that happen there? And, you move outside of an organization to multiple organizations or a government or the UN or whatever it is, like who's responsible for climate change or gender or the intersection of those two things, and finding ways to represent and then help people share stewardship or move beyond some of these models for leading big social change. I think no one has the secret sauce for that. Like, I think that's what everyone's looking for right now. And I think it's a pretty exciting time to try and be a human who wants to move out of crisis and go back to normal, but also recognizes that these things are kind of permanent, and kind of how do we, find a way to get over our just literal genetic allergic reaction to having to constantly acknowledge complexity, which we're not really wired for. I think that's just, it's what keeps me here and doing this. I just think it's endlessly frustrating and challenging and beautiful.
I think that point of the...
Sorry,
go on, Kim.
Do you think, Gina, that part of the issue is that it's never, ever done simultaneously? And to address concerns of complexity across multiple systems, say in an organization, is that humans aren't considered a system. Often they're considered if they agree to the change and agree to, moving forward from either top-down driven strategies, they're kind of cogs that become advocates of the change or systemic change, rather than actually contributing to resolving the change simultaneously. To, as you say, when you start at a particular level of hierarchy, you start trying to break down some of those structures or those controlling structures by getting people to listen to other people underneath them, and not necessarily just imbue practices or processes to control them. So do you think some of the challenges is that if in all the notion of complexity, people are considered as a system, and can be valuable or seen as valuable by those people who want to control systems, will actually enable and empower the organization a little more effectively, rather than this trickle down approach that we're still seeing in a lot of organizations.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And how to do that in a way that's more meaningful for more people, I don't know. But I do think, going back to just some of my comments at the beginning of the call briefly, I do think representation is really important in that. Like, how do you literally visualize and represent you know, systems, human social systems, and by that I mean anything, a city, an organization, a country, whatever it is, in such a way that you can't forget that it's in relation with these problems, it's a contributor to and subject to the consequences of them. And then somehow hold that diversity of human experiences, the resources available in the system for them to do things, the different modes that systems currently have available to them to make decisions, have conversations, you know, use knowledge in different ways. And I think really that's why visual communication, I mean, of course, it's my degree by training, but I think that is what we play around with as a lever a lot, is actually just making material things that aren't. But in a way that's super relevant, and just saying at this point in time, what's the best, most relevant representation of myself and my relationship to this problem, knowing that the longevity and relevance of that, you know, has a pretty short tail these days. And then how do you build conversation structures, practices, rituals, all those sorts of things, languages around that. But yeah, 100% with you on that. I think that's kind of the space we need to get better at figuring out, what does design look like there, which is really just how do you materialize things that help humans be in that space together well.
We should have these chats more often. Bye.
We should.
Indeed.
Nice.